The cold bit into Catherine's skin like the teeth of a hungry wolf as she collapsed on the riverbank, her sodden dress clinging to her trembling body. The rushing waters of the Yellowstone had nearly claimed her life, but somehow she had dragged herself from its icy grip, only to face the merciless Montana winter of 1878 with nothing but the tattered remains of her once fine traveling clothes. The sun was sinking fast behind the jagged mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson that would have been beautiful if Katherine hadn't been certain she was going to die. Her fingers had long since gone numb, her lips blue with cold, and the violent shuddering of her body was beginning to slow a dangerous sign she recognized from stories of winter deaths back in Boston. She closed her eyes, thinking of her family back east. They would never know what happened to her. The letter she had sent announcing her arrival in Helena would become a cruel reminder of promises unfulfilled. This wild country would claim her, just as it had claimed so many others who dared to venture into its untamed beauty. The sound of hoofbeats penetrated her fading consciousness. Probably just her mind playing tricks as it surrendered to the cold. Then a shadow fell across her face, blocking the last rays of the setting sun. Katherine forced her eyes open, her vision blurry as she made out the silhouette of a man astride a horse. "Good Lord," a deep voice exclaimed. What in tarnation? Through half-frozen eyelids, Katherine watched as the stranger dismounted in one fluid motion. He approached cautiously, as one might approach a wounded animal. She tried to speak to call for help, but her voice emerged as nothing more than a weak croak. "Hold on there, miss," the man said, kneeling beside her. His face came into focus, weathered by sun and wind, with eyes the color of the sky after a storm and a strong jawline softened by concern. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low and a beard that couldn't hide the grimace that formed on his lips when he saw her condition. "Our river," Katherine managed to whisper. "You're half frozen," he said, immediately shrugging out of his long coat a heavy duster that carried the scents of leather, horse, and wood smoke. Without hesitation, he wrapped it around her trembling form, enveloping her in warmth that seemed to burn against her ice-cold skin. "Name's Rylan Blackwood," he said, his voice a low rumble as he gathered her into his arms as easily as if she were a child. "And I reckon you're about the luckiest lady in Montana territory right now." Katherine couldn't respond, her teeth chattering too violently as he lifted her onto his horse. She felt him mount behind her, one strong arm securing her against his chest while the other held the reins. "Got a cabin not far from here," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "Hang on tight, I'm not letting go of you, you hear?" As consciousness slipped away from her, Katherine was aware only of the solid warmth of the stranger's chest against her back, and the strange sense that, for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach in this wild country, she might be safe. When Katherine next opened her eyes, she was lying on a rough-hewn bed covered with thick furs, a fire crackling in a stone hearth nearby. The cabin was small but sturdy, with a single room that served as kitchen, dining area, and sleeping quarters all at once. She tried to sit up, but her body protested with a wave of dizziness. "Easy now," came that same deep voice. Rylan moved from where he'd been tending the fire, approaching with a steaming cup in his hand. "You've been out for hours. Thought I might lose you there for a spell." Katherine accepted the cup with trembling hands, inhaling the fragrant steam. "Tea?" she asked, surprised by such a civilized offering in this wilderness. A small smile touched his lips, softening his rugged features. "Not much for fancy things out here, but I do keep tea good for what ails you." She sipped the hot liquid gratefully, feeling it warm her from within. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. I don't know how to repay your kindness." "Rylan," he corrected. "And staying alive would be payment enough. What's your name, if you don't mind my asking?" "Katherine," she replied. "Katherine Harding. And what brings Miss Katherine Harding to be half-drowned in the Yellowstone River in the middle of November?" The question brought back the memories in a rush: the stagecoach, the outlaws, the shots fired, the horses panicking, and the coach overturning at the river crossing. Katherine's hand began to shake so badly that Rylan gently took the cup from her before she could spill it. "The stagecoach was attacked," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. men with bandanas covering their faces. They shot the driver. The horses bolted and we went into the river. She paused, the horror of it washing over her anew. The other passengers, I don't know what happened to them. The current was so strong. Rylan's expression darkened. The Stillwater gang, most likely. They've been hitting stages along that route for months now. He set the cup aside and sat on the edge of the bed, a respectful distance from her. Where were you headed, Helena? My uncle owns a mercantile there. After my parents died last spring, he invited me to come west and help with his business. Katherine looked down at her hands, which were red and raw from the river. Everything I owned was in my trunk on that coach. Rylan was quiet for a moment. We'll get word to your uncle once the weather clears. For now, you need rest. You've had a mighty close call, Miss Harding. Katherine, she said softly. Please call me Katherine. He nodded, the ghost of a smile touching his lips again. You should try to eat something, Katherine. I've got some stew warming. As Rylan moved to the small iron stove, Katherine took the opportunity to study her rescuer more carefully. He moved with the easy grace of a man accustomed to physical work, his shoulders broad beneath a simple flannel shirt. His hair was the color of dark honey, tied back at the nape of his neck, and when he turned to ladle stew into a wooden bowl, she noticed a scar that ran along his jawline. Are you a rancher? She asked, accepting the bowl he brought to her. Rylan shook his head. Not exactly. I trap in these parts, do some hunting, guide work when it's called for. He poured himself a cup of coffee from a pot on the stove. Been in Montana territory going on 8 years now. All alone? The question slipped out before Katherine could consider its propriety. If he was offended, he didn't show it. Yep, just me and Thunder, that's my horse. He settled into a chair near the fire. What about you? Any family waiting besides your uncle? Katherine shook her head, swallowing a spoonful of the surprisingly flavorful stew. No, my mother passed from influenza last winter, and my father, he just seemed to lose his will afterward. By spring, he was gone too. She set the spoon down, suddenly finding it difficult to continue eating. They were devoted to each other. I always hoped to find a love like theirs someday. Rylan's eyes met hers across the room, something unreadable in their depths. That's a rare thing, finding a love worth holding on to. The way he said it made Katherine wonder if there was a story behind those words, but she was too exhausted to ask. The warmth of the cabin and the food in her belly were making it hard to keep her eyes open. Rest now, Rylan said, noticing her struggle. We can talk more tomorrow. Katherine didn't argue. As she settled back among the furs, she found herself wondering about the solitary man who had saved her life, and why someone with such kindness in him chose to live so far from other people. The next few days passed in a blur of rest and recovery. Rylan proved to be a surprisingly attentive caretaker, bringing Katherine food and drink, stoking the fire to keep the cabin warm, and even offering her some of his own clothes to wear while her dress dried. The flannel shirt and trousers were comically large on her slender frame, but they were clean and warm. By the third day, Katherine's strength had returned enough for her to insist on helping with the cooking. Rylan watched with barely concealed amusement as she navigated his primitive kitchen setup. In Boston, we had a proper cook stove, she explained, stirring a pot of beans, and a kitchen made to help with the more difficult tasks. Is that so? Rylan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest. Well, out here we make do with what we have. I'm learning that, Katherine said with a small smile. Though I must say, you seem to manage quite well for a bachelor living alone in the wilderness, Rylan shrugged. Man's got to eat, and I've had plenty of time to practice. Outside, snow had begun to fall, thick flakes drifting past the single window. Katherine watched them accumulate on the ground, a blanket of white covering the rugged landscape. How long do you think before the weather clears enough to travel? She asked, trying to keep the worry from her voice. She was grateful for Rylan's rescue and hospitality, but she was also acutely aware of the impropriety of their situation. A single woman living under the same roof as a man she barely knew would cause a scandal back in Boston. Rylan studied the sky through the window. Hard to say. Could be a few days, could be longer. Winter comes early and stays late in these parts. He glanced at her. Your uncle will understand the delay. No one travels in weather like this if they can help it. Katherine nodded, though uncertainty still gnawed at her. What if her uncle thought she had perished in the stagecoach attack? Or worse, what if he eventually received word that a woman had survived but was now living with a strange man in a remote cabin, as if reading her thoughts? Rylan added, "First chance we get, I'll ride to the nearest settlement and send word to Helena about what happened." "Your reputation will remain intact, Miss Harding." A flush of embarrassment colored Katherine's cheeks. "I didn't mean to imply, no need to explain," he interrupted gently. "I understand how things work in the civilized world. Out here, survival trumps social niceties, but that doesn't mean I don't respect them." Katherine stirred the beans with more force than necessary. "You make it sound as though I'm some delicate flower concerned only with appearances, aren't you?" There was no mockery in his tone, only genuine curiosity. The question caught her off guard. Was that how he saw her? Some prissy Easterner too concerned with propriety to appreciate the reality of frontier life. "I may have been raised in Boston society, Mr. Blackwood, but I'm not as fragile as you seem to think," she said, lifting her chin. "I survived the loss of both my parents within months of each other. I made the decision to travel west alone, and I didn't drown in that river, did I?" A slow smile spread across Rylan's face, transforming his features. "No, madam, you sure didn't." He pushed off from the doorframe and approached the stove, peering into the pot she was tending. "And these beans smell better than any I've made in a long while." The compliment, simple as it was, eased the tension between them. Katherine found herself smiling back at him. "Perhaps I can be of some use while I'm here then, to earn my keep." "I reckon we can find ways for you to help out," Rylan agreed. Then, more seriously, he added, "But don't you worry about earning your keep. Having company after so long alone is payment enough." Something in the way he said it, a hint of loneliness beneath the gruff exterior, touched Katherine deeply. For the first time, she wondered what circumstances had led Rylan Blackwood to choose such a solitary existence. That evening, as they sat before the fire after supper, Katherine found the courage to ask, "How did you come to live out here, so far from everyone?" Rylan was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. Just when Katherine thought he wouldn't answer, he spoke. "I fought in the war, the one between the states, saw things no man should see." His voice was low, almost a murmur. "When it was over, I couldn't go back to Virginia. Too many ghosts there, so I headed west like a lot of other men with nowhere else to go." Katherine watched his profile, strong and solemn in the firelight. "And you've been alone all this time?" "Not entirely," he said. "Worked cattle drives for a few years, did some scouting for the army. Spent time with the Crow people, learned their ways." He took a sip from his coffee cup. "But eventually, I found I preferred my own company to most others. Out here, a man can hear himself think." "It must get lonely," Katherine observed softly. Rylan's eyes met hers across the small space between them. "Sometimes, but loneliness is a quieter pain than some others I've known." The raw honesty in his words stirred something in Katherine's heart. Here was a man who had seen the darkest sides of humanity and chosen solitude as his refuge. Yet he had not hesitated to rescue a stranger, to share his home and provisions with her. "I'm sorry for what you've endured," she said simply. Rylan nodded, acknowledging her words without complaint or self-pity. "Life deals its hands, and we play them as best we can." He set his cup aside and rose from his chair. "Speaking of which, it's getting late. You take the bed again. I'm fine here by the fire." Katherine had protested this arrangement for the past few nights, uncomfortable with displacing him from his own bed, but Rylan had been insistent. Tonight, however, she had a different idea. "I've been thinking," she said hesitantly. "This cabin is too small for one of us to sleep on the floor indefinitely. Perhaps we could share the bed." Before he could respond, she hurried on. "I mean, with a proper barrier between us, of course. We could place some blankets down the middle." Rylan's expression was unreadable in the dim light. "That wouldn't be proper, Katherine. Neither is me taking your bed while you sleep on hard planks," she countered. "And as you said, out here survival trumps social niceties. Neither of us will get proper rest if we continue this way." For a moment, she thought he would refuse again, but then Rylan gave a reluctant nod. "All right, but I'll sleep on top of the furs, not under them, and I'll keep to my side." And so they established a new routine. Each night, Katherine would retire first, positioning herself on the far side of the bed. Rylan would add wood to the fire, check that the door was securely barred, and then lie down beside her, careful to maintain the boundary between them. Despite the impropriety of the arrangement, Katherine found herself sleeping better knowing he was near. Days stretched into a week, and still the snow fell. Katherine learned the rhythms of Rylan's life, how he rose before dawn to check his traps, returned mid-morning with whatever game he had caught, and spent the afternoons maintaining his equipment or chopping wood. She took over the cooking and cleaning, finding satisfaction in the simple domestic tasks. They talked more freely now, sharing stories over meals or during the long evenings by the fire. Katherine told him about her childhood in Boston, her father's shipping business, and her mother's involvement in social reform movements. Rylan spoke of his time with the Crow, the beauty of Montana in different seasons, and occasionally, in quiet tones, memories from before the war. One afternoon, as Rylan taught Katherine how to clean and prepare a rabbit he had snared, she asked a question that had been on her mind. "Have you ever thought of returning to civilization, of having a family?" His hands stilled momentarily. "Once," he admitted. "There was a woman in Helena about 4 years back, daughter of a sawmill owner, thought for a time we might make a go of it." "What happened?" Katherine asked, trying to ignore the unexpected twinge of jealousy the revelation provoked. Rylan resumed his work, his movements precise and efficient. "She wanted a different life than I could give her. Can't blame her for that. Town living, nice house, social gatherings, all the things that make me feel trapped." He glanced up at Katherine. "Not everyone is suited to this kind of existence." There was a question in his eyes that Katherine wasn't ready to answer. Instead, she said, "She must have cared for you a great deal to consider it at all." "Maybe," Rylan allowed. "Or maybe she was just young and thought she could change me." He wrapped the cleaned rabbit meat in a cloth. "What about you? Was there someone special back in Boston?" Katherine shook her head. "There were suitors, of course, men my father approved of from good families, but none that—" She paused, searching for the right words. "None that made your heart beat faster." Rylan suggested, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Something like that," she admitted with a small laugh. "I always felt there should be more to marriage than a good business arrangement. Like your parents had," Rylan recalled. "Yes," Katherine smiled at the memory. "They disagreed sometimes, argued even, but there was never any doubt they were devoted to each other. My father consulted my mother on business matters, which was most unusual, and she supported his decisions, even the risky ones." "Sounds like a true partnership," Rylan observed. "It was," Katherine agreed. "That's why I couldn't accept any of the proposals I received. They all felt incomplete somehow." Rylan studied her face for a moment, then nodded as if coming to some private conclusion. "You deserve that kind of love, Katherine. Don't settle for less." His words warmed her more than they should have. Katherine found herself wondering what it would be like to have Rylan Blackwood look at her the way her father had looked at her mother, with that mixture of desire, respect, and tenderness that had sustained them through decades together. The thought should have alarmed her. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The storm finally broke after 10 days, leaving the landscape transformed under a thick blanket of snow. The morning sun glittered on the pristine white surface, so bright it hurt the eyes to look at it directly. "I'll head out today," Rylan announced over breakfast. "Need to check my trap lines anyway. I can make it to Wilson's trading post by midday, send a message to your uncle in Helena." Katherine felt a strange reluctance at the thought of him leaving, even temporarily. "Will it be safe to travel?" "Safe enough," he assured her. "Thunder knows these trails better than most men. We'll be fine." She nodded, trying to appear unconcerned. "What should I do while you're gone?" "Keep the fire going," Rylan said, rising from the table, "and maybe rest. You've been pushing yourself too hard these past few days." "I'm fully recovered," Katherine protested. Rylan gave her a skeptical look. "Maybe so, but you're still not used to the altitude or the cold. Take it easy today." Katherine wanted to argue further but held her tongue. He was right, she still tired more quickly than she would like to admit. "Very well, I'll try not to burn your cabin down while you're away. That earned her a rare laugh. I'd appreciate that. He moved to gather his gear, checking his rifle and ammunition before donning his heavy coat, the same one he had wrapped around her that first day. Katherine watched him prepare, suddenly anxious. "Be careful," she said as he headed for the door. Rylan paused, turning back to her with an unreadable expression. "Always am," he said softly. Then, with a tip of his hat, he was gone. The cabin felt eerily quiet without him. Katherine busied herself with tasks, washing their breakfast dishes, sweeping the floor, mending a tear in one of Rylan's shirts she had found in his sparse collection of clothing. But the hours stretched endlessly, and she found herself repeatedly going to the window to look for signs of his return. By late afternoon, with the sun already sinking toward the western mountains, Katherine's worry had grown into genuine fear. What if something had happened to him? What if he had encountered the same outlaws who had attacked the stagecoach? What if he had fallen from his horse in some remote spot where no one would find him? Just as she was contemplating the unthinkable, trying to saddle his spare horse and go looking for him herself, she heard the blessed sound of hoofbeats approaching. Katherine rushed to the door, flinging it open just as Rylan dismounted from Thunder. "You're back," she exclaimed, relief making her voice higher than normal. Rylan raised an eyebrow at her enthusiastic greeting. "Said I would be, didn't I?" "Yes, but it's nearly dark, and I thought—" Katherine stopped herself, embarrassed by her obvious concern. A small smile played at the corners of Rylan's mouth. "Were you worried about me, Miss Harding?" "Of course I was," she admitted. "This is dangerous country, as I have good reason to know." Rylan led Thunder to the small lean-to stable attached to the cabin. "Got held up at the trading post, lots of news to catch up on after being snowed in." He began unsaddling the horse, "And I wanted to wait for a reply from Helena." Katherine's heart leapt. "You heard from my uncle?" "Not directly," Rylan said, his tone carefully neutral. "Wilson's got a telegraph line now. He sent a message to Helena and got one back while I waited." Something in his manner made Katherine uneasy. "What did it say?" Rylan finished with Thunder's tack before answering. When he finally turned to face her, his expression was grave. "Your uncle, George Harding. He passed away 3 weeks ago. Influenza outbreak in Helena." The news hit Katherine like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, would have fallen if Rylan hadn't moved quickly to catch her arms. "No," she whispered. "That can't be right. He wrote to me just last month. He was in perfect health." "I'm sorry, Katherine," Rylan said gently. "The sickness came on suddenly. Half the town was affected." Katherine's mind reeled. Her uncle, her last living relative, gone before she even reached him. The future she had planned, working in his store, building a new life in Helena, vanished in an instant. "What am I going to do?" she asked, not really expecting an answer. "Where will I go?" Rylan's hands tightened slightly on her arms. "You don't have to decide that right away. You can stay here as long as you need to." Katherine looked up at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "I can't impose on you indefinitely." "It's no imposition," he said firmly. "Truth is, I've gotten used to having you around." A hint of color touched his weathered cheeks. "Besides, winter's just beginning. No sense making any hasty decisions until spring at least." The offer was generous, more than generous, yet Katherine couldn't help wondering if it was wise to accept. Already, she was developing feelings for this quiet, honorable man that went far beyond gratitude. Living under his roof for months more would only deepen those feelings. "I should at least try to find work," she said. "In one of the settlements. I can't just exist here, contributing nothing." "You contribute plenty," Rylan countered. "But if it makes you feel better, we can talk about arrangements. Maybe you could help with the furs. I'm not much hand at the finer work, tanning and such. Fetch a better price with proper finishing." It was a transparent attempt to give her a purpose, to justify her continued presence, but Katherine appreciated it nonetheless. "I don't know the first thing about preparing furs." "I can teach you," Rylan said simply. "Same as you've been teaching me about proper table manners." The gentle teasing brought a small smile to Katherine's lips despite her grief. "Very well, Mr. Blackwood. It seems we have an arrangement." As they walked back to the cabin together, Katherine felt a curious mixture of sorrow and hope. She had lost everyone she had ever loved, her parents, and now her uncle. Yet somehow, in this remote wilderness, She had found someone who seemed to understand her in ways those others never had. The winter months passed in a rhythm all their own. Katherine learned the art of preparing furs under Rylan's patient tutelage, how to stretch and clean them, how to smoke and tan the hides to preserve them. In return, she brought small civilizing touches to the cabin: curtains made from an old shirt, a proper table setting for meals, songs and stories in the evenings. They settled into a comfortable routine that felt, to Katherine's surprise, like a real home. Rylan made periodic trips to the trading post, bringing back supplies and occasional luxuries: coffee, sugar, a length of calico that Katherine fashioned into a new dress. On clear days, they ventured out together, Rylan teaching her to identify animal tracks in the snow, to move quietly through the forest, to appreciate the stark beauty of the Montana winter. At night, they still shared the bed with the careful barrier between them, though Katherine found herself increasingly aware of Rylan's presence, the sound of his breathing, the warmth that radiated from his body, the way he sometimes murmured in his sleep. More than once, she woke to find that one of them had crossed the invisible boundary, an arm or leg seeking warmth in the cold night. It was during one such night, with a fierce February blizzard howling outside, that everything changed between them. Katherine had been dreaming of the river again, of the icy water closing over her head, of struggling to reach the surface as her sodden clothes dragged her down. She woke with a gasp, her heart pounding, disoriented in the darkness. "Katherine." Rylan's voice came from beside her, thick with sleep but concerned. "What is it?" "Just a dream," she managed to say, though she was trembling violently. "The river." Without hesitation, Rylan reached across the space between them and pulled her into his arms. "You're safe," he murmured against her hair. "I've got you. You're safe now." Katherine should have protested, should have maintained the propriety they had so carefully preserved. Instead, she buried her face against his chest, drawing comfort from his solid presence. His hand stroked her back in slow, soothing circles, his touch gentle despite the calluses that roughened his palm. "I thought I was going to die," she whispered. "When I saw you riding up, I thought you were an angel coming to take me to heaven." Rylan gave a soft chuckle. "No one's ever mistaken me for an angel before." "You were to me," Katherine said, lifting her head to look at him in the dim light cast by the banked fire. "You saved my life, Rylan." He reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "And you brought life back to this cabin," he said softly. "I didn't realize how empty it was until you filled it." The intensity in his gaze made Katherine's breath catch. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Rylan leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, a question more than a demand. Katherine answered by sliding her arms around his neck, drawing him closer. Something broke loose inside her, a need she had never acknowledged, a hunger she had never allowed herself to feel. Rylan groaned softly as she responded, his arms tightening around her. When they finally parted, both breathless, Rylan rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. "Why didn't you?" Katherine asked, her fingers toying with the hair at the nape of his neck. "Because you deserve better than a rough mountain man with nothing to offer but a one-room cabin and a life of hardship." His voice was ragged with emotion. "You're meant for fine things, Katherine. For a proper home and a husband who can give you the life you're used to." Katherine shook her head. "I don't want the life I'm used to. I never did. That's why I came west." She placed her hand against his cheek, feeling the scratch of his beard against her palm. "And you have given me something far more valuable than any material comfort. You've shown me what it means to be truly self-sufficient, to live deliberately, to find beauty in simplicity." Rylan captured her hand, turning it to press a kiss to her palm. "I'm not an easy man, Katherine. I've lived alone too long. I have dark memories that still haunt me. I'm not asking for easy," she said. "I'm asking for real, for true." She smiled slightly. "And I have a few ghosts of my own to contend with." He studied her face in the dim light, as if searching for any sign of doubt or hesitation. Finding none, he kissed her again, more deeply this time, with a passion that left no question of his feelings. That night changed everything between them. The careful barrier down the middle of the bed was abandoned. They began to touch each other freely, a hand on a shoulder while passing, fingers intertwined as they sat before the fire, embraces that grew increasingly intimate as the days passed. Yet Rylan remained honorable, never pressing for more than Katherine was ready to give. "When we come together fully," he told her one evening as they lay in bed, his lips tracing the delicate curve of her ear, "it will be as husband and wife." The declaration, so casually made, brought tears to Katherine's eyes. "Are you asking me to marry you, Rylan Blackwood?" He propped himself up on one elbow, gazing down at her with a seriousness that made her heart ache. "I'm asking if you could see yourself spending your life with a man like me." "In a place like this, it won't be easy, Katherine. There will be harsh winters, lean times, dangers aplenty. There will also be beauty beyond compare," she countered. "Freedom to live as we choose, the satisfaction of building something together with our own hands." She reached up to touch his face. "And love, there will be love, won't there? More than you can imagine," Rylan promised, his voice husky with emotion. "I've loved you since I found you by that river, though I fought against it, knowing you deserved better." "There is no better," Katherine said firmly. "Not for me. My answer is yes, Rylan. Yes, I will marry you." The joy that transformed his features in that moment was something Katherine knew she would remember until her dying day. He gathered her close, kissing her with a tenderness that spoke more eloquently than any words of the depth of his feelings. As March gave way to April, the snow began to recede, revealing patches of muddy ground and the first tender shoots of spring growth. Rylan made more frequent trips to the trading post, returning with supplies for their future together, seeds for a garden, tools for expanding the cabin, fabric for Katherine to sew curtains and quilts. On one such trip, he brought back a surprise, a proper gold band for Katherine's finger. "It's not fancy," he apologized as he slipped it onto her hand, "but it's real gold, panned from the creek that runs through our property." "You made this?" Katherine asked, admiring the simple ring. "Had Wilson's wife helped me with the final shaping," Rylan admitted. "But yes, the gold is from our land. Seemed fitting." "It's perfect," Katherine declared, kissing him soundly. "When shall we make it official?" "There's a circuit preacher coming through Granite Creek next week," Rylan told her. "If the weather holds, we could ride down." "Be there and back in 3 days." Katherine's heart leapt at the thought. "Yes," she said eagerly. "Let's do that." The wedding was simple, a brief ceremony in Granite Creek's small church, with only the preacher, his wife, and a few curious townspeople as witnesses. Katherine wore her calico dress, freshly washed and pressed. Rylan had shaved his beard and donned the one proper shirt he owned, looking so handsome that Katherine's breath caught when she first saw him waiting for her. "Do you, Rylan James Blackwood, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the preacher asked. "I do," Rylan answered, his voice strong and sure, "for as long as we both shall live." "And do you, Katherine Elizabeth Harding, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Katherine said, smiling up at the man who had rescued her from the river and from loneliness. "With all my heart." When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Rylan gathered Katherine into his arms and kissed her with such tenderness that several of the townswomen sighed audibly. Then, with congratulations ringing in their ears, they mounted their horses and began the journey back to their mountain home. They spent that night at a small hunting cabin Rylan knew of, halfway between Granite Creek and their own homestead. There, beside a crackling fire, they consummated their marriage with a passion that left them both breathless and wondering at the miracle they had found in each other's arms. "I never thought I'd have this," Rylan confessed later as Katherine lay with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "After the war, I figured whatever capacity I had for love had been burned out of me." Katherine pressed a kiss to his skin. "And I never thought I'd find a man who would see me, truly see me, and not just the proper Boston lady I was raised to be." Rylan's fingers trailed lazily up and down her bare arm. "I saw you that first day, soaking wet and half frozen, saw your strength then, knew you were something special." "Is that why you wrapped me in your coat?" Katherine asked, smiling at the memory despite its harrowing nature. "Partly," Rylan admitted, "but mostly I just couldn't bear the thought of you being cold." His arms tightened around her. "Still can't." Then you'll just have to keep me warm for the rest of our lives, Katherine murmured, nestling closer against him. That's a promise I aim to keep, Rylan vowed, pulling the blankets more securely around them both. The years that followed were not without challenges. Their first summer together brought drought, making it difficult to establish the garden Katherine had planned. Their second winter saw Rylan laid low with a fever that had Katherine fearing for his life before it finally broke. There were encounters with hostile strangers, difficulties with wild predators threatening their livestock, and the normal hardships of frontier life. But there were joys, too immeasurable joys that made every hardship worthwhile. They expanded the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and a larger kitchen. They acquired a milk cow, chickens, and eventually a small herd of cattle. Katherine learned to hunt alongside Rylan, becoming a fair shot with both rifle and bow. Rylan, in turn, took to reading the books Katherine ordered from back east, developing a particular fondness for Shakespeare and Thoreau. 3 years after their wedding, Katherine gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Sarah, after Rylan's mother. 2 years later came James, named for Katherine's father. Both children grew strong and healthy in the mountain air, learning from their parents a blend of frontier self-sufficiency and Eastern refinement that served them well. As the territory around them slowly filled with other settlers, Rylan and Katherine maintained their somewhat isolated lifestyle, though they developed friendships with a few like-minded neighbors. Their home became known as a place of warm hospitality, where travelers could find a good meal and a comfortable place to sleep, along with conversation that ranged from practical matters of homesteading to philosophical discussions of man's place in nature. On the 10th anniversary of the day Rylan had found Katherine by the river, they stood together on the porch of their now substantial home, watching their children play in the yard with the puppies from their dog's latest litter. "Do you ever regret it?" Rylan asked, his arm around Katherine's waist. "Staying here with me instead of going back to civilization." Katherine looked up at him, at the face that had become dearer to her than any other in the world. The years had added a few more lines around his eyes, a touch of silver at his temples, but to her, he was more handsome than ever. "Not for a single moment," she said truthfully. "This is where I belong, with you." Rylan bent to kiss her, a gesture that had lost none of its tenderness or passion over the years. "Remember what I told you that first day," he murmured against her lips. "When I wrapped you in my coat," Katherine smiled, recalling his words as clearly as if he had spoken them yesterday. "You said you weren't letting go of me, and I never have," Rylan said, drawing her closer against him as they watched the sun set behind the mountains they both called home. "Not once in all these years, not ever." "I'm glad," Katherine whispered, resting her head against his shoulder. "Because I've never let go of you either." As twilight deepened around them, they remained on the porch, holding each other just as they had that first day by the river, two souls who had found in each other not just warmth and shelter, but the truest meaning of home. The years continued to flow by like the river that had brought them together, sometimes rushing with excitement, sometimes meandering peacefully, but always moving forward, always carrying them along its course together. When Sarah turned 16, a talented young blacksmith from a neighboring settlement began to court her with Rylan's cautious blessing. Katherine watched with amusement as her husband struggled with the idea of his daughter growing up, alternating between gruff intimidation of her suitor and quiet pride in the beautiful, capable young woman she had become. "She reminds me of you," Rylan told Katherine one evening as they watched Sarah teaching her younger brother how to properly set a rabbit trap. "She has that same fire in her spirit. And your stubbornness," Katherine replied with a smile. "Heaven help young mister Collins if he thinks he's getting an obedient, docile wife," Rylan chuckled. "I reckon he knows what he's in for. Boy's smarter than he looks." 2 years later, they hosted Sarah's wedding on their property, with neighbors and friends gathering from miles around to celebrate. Katherine wept as she watched Rylan walk their daughter to her groom, his face a study in pride and sorrow, joy in letting go. That night, after the guests had departed and the newlyweds had left for their own small cabin not far away, Rylan and Katherine sat before the fire, contemplative. Did I ever thank you? Rylan asked suddenly. Katherine looked at him quizzically. For what? For staying, for building this life with me. He gestured to the comfortable home around them, so different from the sparse cabin it had once been. For giving me a family when I thought I'd live and die alone. You didn't need to thank me, Katherine said softly. I was the one who had lost everything when you found me. You gave me a reason to live again. Rylan reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over the gold band he had placed there so many years before. We saved each other, I reckon. As their children grew and began families of their own, Rylan and Katherine found new joys in grandparenthood. They watched with pride as James took over most of the ranching operations, introducing new techniques he had learned during a year spent working on a large cattle spread in Wyoming. Their home often echoed with the laughter of grandchildren, eager for Grandpa Rylan's stories of the old days and Grandma Katherine's cookies and lessons in reading and writing. Life wasn't always kind. They lost a beloved horse to mountain lions one harsh winter. A particularly bad drought led to forest fires that threatened their property and forced a temporary evacuation. And as they entered their 60s, both began to feel the accumulated aches and strains of a life lived close to the land. But through it all, they remained as devoted to each other as they had been from the beginning. Each night, Rylan still wrapped Katherine in his arms as they slept, keeping her warm as he had promised. Each morning, Katherine still woke before him to start the coffee, knowing the rich aroma would bring a smile to his face even before he opened his eyes. On the evening of their 40th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren organized a surprise celebration. Neighbors and friends from throughout the region gathered to honor the couple whose story had become something of a legend in those parts, the half-drowned Boston lady and the solitary trapper who had rescued her from certain death. As the festivities wound down and the younger generations began the cleanup, Rylan took Katherine's hand and led her away from the gathering, down the familiar path to the river. The spring evening was mild, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, not unlike those of the day they had first met. I wanted to show you something, Rylan said as they reached the riverbank. Katherine followed his gaze to a small stone marker set into the ground, partially hidden by wildflowers. Kneeling beside it, she read the simple inscription. Here Rylan found Katherine, 1878, and never let go. Tears filled her eyes as she looked up at her husband, still handsome despite his now white hair and the deep lines experience had etched into his face. When did you do this? For our 25th, Rylan admitted. Never got around to showing you, figured 40 years was a good time. Katherine rose and wrapped her arms around him, breathing in the familiar scent of him leather and pine and something uniquely Rylan that had meant home to her for 4 decades. It's perfect, she whispered against his chest. They stood together by the river as twilight deepened around them, holding each other just as they had that first day. The years had changed them both, but the love between them had only grown stronger, deeper, more essential to their very being. You know, Rylan said softly, his chin resting on top of Katherine's head, I used to wonder if I deserved this happiness, if a man with my past had any right to such joy. And now, Katherine asked, looking up at him. Rylan smiled, the expression lighting his weathered features with the same warmth that had first captivated her so long ago. Now I know that love isn't about deserving, it's about receiving with gratitude and giving with an open heart. He cupped her face in his calloused hands. And I am grateful every day for the gift I found shivering beside this river. As am I, Katherine said, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his. For the man who wrapped me in his coat and kept his promise never to let go. As darkness fell, and the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, they made their way back to the house they had built together, not just the physical structure, but the home they had created through years of shared joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges, love given and received in equal measure. And if anyone passing by had seen the elderly couple walking hand in hand, they might have glimpsed in them the echoes of a younger pair, a half-frozen woman and the man who had saved her life, starting out on a journey neither could have imagined, but both would always treasure. For in the end, their story was not just about survival or even love, but about two souls who had found in each other the courage to build a life of purpose and meaning in a wild and beautiful land. A life that would live on in their children and grandchildren, in the land they had stewarded, and in the hearts of all who knew their story and understood its simple truth. That sometimes, the greatest acts of heroism are not grand gestures, but quiet promises kept through the changing seasons of a lifetime. "I've never regretted it, you know," Katherine said later that night as they prepared for bed in the room that had been theirs for nearly 4 decades. "Not once in all these years." "Regretted what?" Rylan asked, turning down the lamp. "Falling into that river," she said with a small smile. "If I hadn't, I might never have found you." Rylan chuckled as he slipped into bed beside her, gathering her close as he had done every night since they were married. "Only you would find the bright side of nearly freezing to death." "It led me to the warmest heart I've ever known," Katherine murmured, settling against him with the familiar ease of long-practiced habit. "How could I regret that?" As sleep claimed them, wrapped in each other's arms beneath the quilt Katherine had made for their 10th anniversary, they were, as they had always been, two people who had found in each other not just shelter from life's storms, but the very reason for weathering them. And so their story continued, written not in grand gestures or momentous events, but in the quiet, everyday moments of a love that had begun beside a river and flowed onward through the years, as constant and enduring as the mountains that surrounded their home.